I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
This morning we return to our series, Placing the Bible in Time and Place. It's a series that will be continuing a lot this year, and probably a lot like the song series, which was intended for a year and has developed into multi-years. This series is an interesting one to me. Whether we do a standalone lesson or I just incorporate some of the stuff into my lessons anyway, remains to be seen, but we are going to continue with this for much of this year, the Lord willing. And so what we're going to be talking about today is something that we refer to a lot. In fact, I noticed it was on the timeline in our Bible class. As an event we just accept as fact. We just pass over it sometimes, and we don't really give a thought of it. And the reason why we don't give a thought about it is because a lot of the events are talking about events that may be talked about in the Bible, but are not, unlike the conquest of Jericho or the conquest of Ai, it's not really talked about in the present tense in the Bible. And so we sometimes will miss out on that. And what we're talking about, of course, is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Before we get there, we need to have a little bit of history about Jerusalem and its temple so that we can understand what the temple was when Jesus walked this earth and what exactly was destroyed. So let's go to Joshua 15. Joshua 15 and verse 63. As for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem unto this day. We're talking in our podcast about the conquest of Canaan. Israel went into Jericho, defeated that city. They lost the first time in Ai because of Achan, but eventually they took Ai. From there they went up to Shechem in order to worship God as Moses commanded them there. But after that, we see Joshua next, and the armies of Israel next, moving south and defeating the peoples to the south. And they did that with the exception of the people of Gibeon, where they made a covenant that they shouldn't have. But they conquered all those cities down in Judah except for one, Jerusalem. They couldn't drive out the Jebusites. And that tells us that they didn't have faith in God, because God would have driven them out. But they didn't drive out the Jebusites. The Jebusites remained, it says to this day. That means the time of the writing of Joshua, the Jebusites still lived in Jerusalem. In fact, it wouldn't be till 2 Samuel that we actually find Jerusalem coming under Israel's control. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, and beginning at verse 4, there we read, David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and he reigned over Jerusalem 33 years, over all Israel and Judah. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who spoke to David, saying, You shall not come in here, but the blind and the lame will repel you, thinking, David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. Now David said on that day, Whoever climbs up by the way of the water shaft and defeats the Jebusites, the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul, he shall be chief and captain. Therefore they say, The blind and the lame shall not come into the house. Then David dwelt in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built all around from the Milo and inward. So David went on and became great, and the Lord God of hosts was with him. It's about 400 years between Israel entering the promised land and David actually conquering what would be its capital. Up until that point, Shiloh was where the tabernacle was. It had actually moved around to different places by the time of David. But it wouldn't be until the days of David that Jerusalem would be taken. In fact, what is Jerusalem? We often think of Jerusalem today as this metropolis, and it is. But at that time, it's not the same area. It didn't cover the same land. What are we talking about? David actually took this. Here's the Kidron Valley, right here. The Valley of Hinnom comes around here. There's another valley around here, and there's actually a valley that comes right along the side. The city of David is not that big of a place. In fact, this is what it likely looked like. Very similar to this. This is a model. City of David would have been just this section here. Just this section here. Makes the story of David and Bathsheba make a lot more sense. If David's palace is something like maybe up here, and he's looking down on a woman who's bathing on a roof, it's not that much space. Now, you realize, okay, that story makes maybe a little bit more sense as to why David could see this woman, because she wasn't far away like we think of. David built the surrounding walls of Jerusalem. This is the city of David. It's not the big metropolis. Even today, when you take a look at the map, Jews will differentiate between Jerusalem and what is known as the city of David. Jerusalem all would be known as the city of David. But in the time of David, this is what he ruled over. All in told, it's 12.3 acres, which, if you're watching football today, was 9 football fields. About 9 football fields. Not that big. Not that big at all. Now, when Solomon built the first temple, he did not build it in the city of David. He built it just north of the city of David on Mount Moriah. And Mount Moriah, of course, when you come back up here, you'll notice, although it may be a little hard to see just because the angle that they have the model at, Mount Moriah is up here. It's a little higher, especially when the temple structure wasn't built. It's a little higher than the city of David. And we know that Solomon built it here because the scriptures tell us that. In 2 Chronicles chapter 3, in verses 1 and 2. 2 Chronicles 3, verses 1 and 2. There we read, "Now Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to David his father, at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And he began to build on the 2nd day of the second month in the 4th year of his reign." So the building of the temple actually extended the borders of Jerusalem. City of David, Temple Mount, we're talking about is right here. Wow, not me. Temple Mount is right here, north on Mount Moriah. And so the temple is there. In the days of Hezekiah, the walls of Jerusalem were extended even further. We go to 2 Chronicles 32. 2 Chronicles 32, verses 1 to 5. "After these deeds of faithfulness, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and entered Judah. He encamped against the fortified cities, thinking to win themselves over to himself. And when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come, and that his purpose was to make war against Jerusalem, he consulted with his leaders and commanders to stop the water from the springs which were outside the city, and they helped him. Thus many of the people gathered together, who stopped all the springs and the brook that ran through the land, saying, 'Why should the kings of Assyria come and find much water?' And he strengthened himself, built up all the wall that was broken, raised it up to the towers, and built another wall outside. Also he repaired the mile of the city of David, and made weapons and shields in abundance. So what we find here is City of David again, Temple Mount. That's when Hezekiah started to reign. There's this valley coming through here that carries water with it. Well, Hezekiah didn't want the water to be found by the Assyrians, because that would give them the abilities to do things and maybe attack the city and, of course, get water themselves. So what he did was he repaired the Milos here, surroundings here, and he built another wall that surrounded all of the valley. The Kidron Valley here, where Jesus goes out to the Mount of Olives, which is over here, that's a big valley. And so this was a protection. This hill was a protection, a natural protection, along with the wall that went on it. And so Jerusalem expanded greatly in the days of Hezekiah. This is the Jerusalem that Nebuchadnezzar burned at the end of 2 Kings. Now, when the Jews initially returned from captivity and rebuilt the city, as it stood, they rebuilt the city as it was in the days of Solomon. They only rebuilt this at the beginning. When you read of Nehemiah building the walls of Jerusalem, this is what he's building here. And the temple, which was a very grand temple in the days of Solomon, was a very modest temple in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so all we have was that. And over the next 500 years, the city was expanded upon. It eventually expanded back to what it was in the days of Hezekiah. But it was even expanded upon further. If you notice the difference, I know the map's not completely blown up the same. You notice the difference? This is what it was a lot of the time, but Jerusalem extended further in the days of Jesus. Jerusalem included this. By the time we get to 70 AD, there's even a further wall that goes off the map. You can sort of see it, see this part coming in here, this part coming around here. There's a third wall that would be present in 70 AD. Herod the Great, if you notice the difference, Temple Mount's big, but not as big. Temple Mount here is huge compared to what it was before. That's because Herod the Great expanded upon and rebuilt the temple into a grand structure that existed in Jesus' day. In fact, even though we read of the temple in Jesus' day, and John chapter 2 said it was 47 years to build the temple, it actually wasn't finished in the days of Jesus. They continued to work on it until about 64 AD, 6 years before it was burned down. Here's where the temple was, right here. This would be the temple structure. You'd have the court of women here, and you'd have the temple itself. We'll get a better picture of it in a second. And the Temple Mount, though, was this large part right here. And so what we have is, this is a model of what the temple looked like. It's a model, and so it really doesn't do it justice as to how big it was. But this is what people think the temple looked like in the days of Jesus. You'd have the mount here, this entire thing, and the temple would be here. And the court of women and where the priests were back here, and this is the temple where the Holy of Holies and everything is found. This is what it looked like in 1931, which is after, of course, Jerusalem had been controlled by the Muslims. And in 1931, before World War II, Israel didn't exist on the map. This was Palestine. It was controlled by the Muslims. The Temple Mount is this thing right here. The walls had been rebuilt somewhat because here sits the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Still stands today. But the reason why I wanted you to see this picture is because it shows you how big the Temple Mount was. Today, they planted a lot of trees on the Temple Mount, and what you have here is basically where people believe the temple stood, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque stands with it. And there is, and that's what the temple looked like. In total, Remember, the city of David was 9 football fields. The Temple Mount was 35 acres, which is 25 football fields. And so that's the vastness that when we get to Matthew 24, which you can turn to right now, that's what we're talking about when we get to Matthew 24. And the disciples are admiring the buildings of the temple. In Matthew chapter 24, in verses 1 and 2, then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. So, again, Temple Mount here. Big place, temple here. And this is what the temple looked like. They're admiring. There would be buildings out here. That would be Jerusalem itself. But there's a lot of grand buildings. The structure itself is very ornate. And the disciples are admiring it. When you stood outside, you could still see it. Especially the further away you stood, they were admiring it. And they're saying, look at all these grand buildings. What did Jesus say? It's all going to be destroyed. If you remember on 9/11, those who were about 25 years and older, remember 9/11. 2 twin towers, masterpieces of American architecture. No one thought they could fall until September 11, 2001. This was the equivalent of the Jews' 9/11. No one thought that this grand structure, especially surrounded by the walls that it was surrounded by, could fall. And that's why they asked the question that they did. So if we continue on in verses 3 to 14 of Matthew 24. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations. And then the end will come. Now, remember I said, I don't remember if I have the map next. I don't. The map had the Mount of Olives over off to the side over here. You could see the temple from the Mount of Olives. And so, since this was so unbelievable, how in the world could this temple fall? That's why the disciples asked the question, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming? And what will be the end of the age? Now, I've taught from this chapter a few times. I know Bill has, I think, too. And I'm sure other preachers who've been here have taught from this chapter as well. Jesus is answering 2 questions in this chapter. And the way I divide this chapter up is that the first question is answered in the first 35 verses. And the last question, talking about his second coming, is in verses 36 at the end of the chapter. And even into the 25th chapter, when it deals with the parable of the 10 virgins. And we're only going to really be focusing on the first question. We'll deal with at the end the second question. But we're going to be focusing on that first question. When will these things be? When will these things be? The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, when will it be? Well, Jesus said they would hear of wars and rumors of wars. Remember that for later. There would be famines before that happened. There were famines in Jerusalem and Judea in the book of Acts. End of 1 Corinthians. Corinthians were sending funds there. because of famines that were there. Those occurred in the 60s AD. There would be earthquakes in various places. I looked this up to see if there was one. There was. The major earthquake in Pompeii in 62 AD. It didn't level the city, severely damaged the city, and was probably a precursor to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD that completely destroyed Pompeii. But all these things, these famines, these earthquakes, wars and rumors of wars, that wasn't a sign of the end. It was a sign of the beginning of sorrows. Some of Christ's followers, they'd be thrown into prison and killed. Peter and Paul didn't live to see the destruction of Jerusalem. They were killed before that by Nero. Nero died before the destruction of Jerusalem. Other people were imprisoned as Christians, and others were killed. Nero had Christians killed in Rome after Rome burned, and he blamed them for it. When these things happened, the end was not yet. And the end in this chapter, we need to remember, unless we're talking at the end of the age, is the end of Jerusalem. It's not always read end times whenever we see the word end. In this context, it's the end of Jerusalem. Now, with all this, what would be the end, the signal of the end, the sign of the end of Jerusalem and its temple? Let's continue reading in verses 15 to 22. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of the house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor shall ever be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. So what would signify the end would be the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. What Jesus is talking about is Daniel 11, verse 31, when he said, and forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress, then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. When Daniel spoke those words, the temple wasn't standing. Daniel was in Babylon. The Jews were in captivity, and yet we're prophesying here about a temple. The next temple that would come. Now, Matthew is a little unclear as to whether this meant, the abomination of desolation meant Jerusalem's temple or the city itself. Luke is a little bit more clear. In Luke 21, in verses 20 to 24, same context, just different account. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know that the desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress on the land and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and be led away captive in all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So it's clear. The sign was when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. If you were a follower of Jesus, you knew, flee to the mountains. Get as far away as possible. The next question we have, okay, is this prophecy soon? Or is this prophecy like maybe Daniel's prophecy, hundreds of years in the future? Well, let's read verses 32 to 35 of Matthew 24. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, at the doors. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Jesus' prophecy in 33 AD was for that generation. In other words, it would occur in the lifespans of some of them. Now, Jesus' disciples were the only ones listening to this. That doesn't mean it didn't apply to other people. But the Apostle John lived to see the destruction of Jerusalem. Or at least he was alive at that time. Probably some of the other apostles were as well. We know Peter was dead. We know James was dead. But that doesn't mean all the other apostles were dead. So it would be in the generation, though, of that lifetime. In that lifetime, it's not talking about 400, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years. There's no temple in Jerusalem today. We saw pictures of it right now. It was talking about in that lifetime. So that's the introduction. The rest of the lesson's not really going to take that long. But that gets us to the question of the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome. That's the scripture. Let's see how that scripture was fulfilled. Let's see how the Romans took Israel and Jerusalem. The war actually didn't start in 70 AD. It actually started about 3 to 4 years earlier when Jewish religious zealots began to revolt against Roman rule. What we're going to rely on for our testimony here is Josephus. Josephus wrote in the War of the Jews, and Josephus was captured by Vespasian in this war that started in about 67 AD. And he became friends, or at least not enemies, with Vespasian and Titus, who allowed him to accompany the Roman army and actually witness some of the events that he writes about. There's going to be a few other sources, but Josephus is who we're going to be relying on a lot for this extra-biblical war that was prophesied in the Scriptures. So the map, which is from Satellite Bible Atlas, I can't put it online, but you can see it in your handouts and on the screen right now. So what we have is a revolt. Here's Caesarea, here, halfway down the coast. It's a little harder to see, I know, but here's Caesarea. That's where Cornelius was in Acts 10. War started here. And then spread throughout all Galilee up here. And Judea down here in about 66, 67 AD. Remember, I told you, wars and rumors of wars. Jews would hear this. This should get people's minds thinking. If you were a Christian in Judea, oh, the Romans are coming. Perhaps that's a sign that we should be watching for. Perhaps it's not, but perhaps it is. In 67 AD, the strategy of the Roman campaign was related to the geographical features of this land. You see from our podcast, you know there's mountains here. Mountains all the way through here. It's not a plain, it's not flat land. And so if you're going to have a military campaign, use the land to your advantage. And so what happened was, Vespasian, when he came in from Rome, didn't come down to Caesarea. He actually started up here. Actually started north of there, actually. And what he was doing, he had to secure the coast. If you're gonna pin Israel in, well, you have to get the escape routes gone. So he had to secure the coast. So he came down. Vespasian is the commander. Comes down to Ptolemais here. Then he comes down to Caesarea, and from there, there was wars that broke out here near Cana of Galilee. And there was a 47-day siege, actually. There's a major war up here. This is where Josephus was captured. And after this war, after Vespasian wins here, he comes down to Caesarea. And it's from Caesarea that really is the base of operation, where everything's going to originate from. And so what happened here, from Caesarea, he came down to Joppa, and he came down to Azotus here, and he completely controlled the coast of Palestine. There was no way out to the west. Then Vespasian had Titus, who was his son, second in command. He would come up here, and then he would come through the Jezreel Valley. There's mountains here, there's mountains here, and he'd come up through the valley up into Galilee, and he would, in about 67 AD, bring Galilee into Roman control. So we have Nazareth is here, we have Capernaum here, Gennesaret here, Sea of Galilee's here, and those are cities that we recognize. Romans had control of the western part in 67 AD. Then they came around the south part. This is where Jesus fed the 5,000 in here, healed a lot of people in here, and they controlled this part as well. All of this by the end of 67 AD. 68 AD had Vespasian still in Caesarea. We're going to follow this blue line, and he's going to come down, and he's going to conquer all of this land. In fact, it was so bad that the Jordan River at flood stage in the spring and the Dead Sea were said to be filled with dead bodies. What was Vespasian doing? Well, Jerusalem's here. He's cutting off the east. The road, we know that there is a road from Jerusalem to Jericho, but he's cutting off the east. You'd have to go south of the Dead Sea and around into the desert. So Vespasian is cutting off the escape routes there. Vespasian then also came down to Antipatris, Lod, and Emmaus. That's this blue route here. Emmaus, road to Emmaus. That's where Jesus appeared to the two men on that road. And so Jerusalem was now going to be cut off from the west. They couldn't even get to the sea. The Samaritans, when he did this, who were unwisely, came along and tried to help the Jews because they didn't like the Romans either. And so that's why we have this arrow coming up here. Vespasian came along and he put an end to that. Shechem is here. That was Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, and Shechem were all there. Well, Shechem was, oops, that's not what I wanted. Shechem was renamed Neapolis. Neapolis means new city, and why do I mention that? Well, the Arabic name of that city today is Nablus, which is the same. It means new city. That is the city of Shechem. So from here, from Shechem, he came down to Jericho, and we know the road to Jericho went to Jerusalem. So now in 68 AD, Jerusalem is now fully cut off from the east. They're cut off from the west, they're cut off from the east, still haven't escaped to the south, but it's a lot harder. Once you go south of Jerusalem, you're getting into desert, and it's much harder to escape to the south. 69 AD is really a year of turmoil. It's a year of turmoil in the Roman Empire because Nero died in late 68 AD. There were 4 emperors in Rome in 69 AD, of which Vespasian is the last. Remember, he's the commander in Palestine, but he becomes emperor in 69 AD. And in Israel, a lot of internal fighting going on. There wasn't much more land taken in 69 AD because of all the political upheaval. But this is the situation when we get to 70 AD. So in 70 AD, Titus, he's Vespasian's son, he's the one who's going to lead the campaign to finish him off. So we have the 10th Legion. He was going to lead the 10th Legion, which is around here. He's going to lead it, and they're going to come from the east. He's going to lead up the 11th Legion, which is, where did it go? Oh, the 11th and 15th Legions are here. They were at Shechem. And the 5th Legion's going to come in as well. They're going to approach Jerusalem from the north. They stopped at Gibeath Saul, which is up here, just around Gibeon. That's Gibeah of Saul, where there was a strategic pinch point for where water drained out, where you got water. And so what this was again, it's getting all of this land was pinning the people of Jerusalem in. And what we have now on our map is the actual siege itself. Jerusalem, I said, was a lot larger than it was in the days of Jesus. We had this third wall. Here's the pool of Bethesda. This is what existed in the days of Jesus, but they had extended the wall all the way around. There were 3 walls. There was this wall, and that wall. And so the siege started on about the 14th of April, 70 A.D. Why is that important? That's Passover time. Many people were in Jerusalem. Probably about 600,000 people were in Jerusalem. And now we can understand why 600,000 can fit in Jerusalem. It's a huge city. That's when Titus surrounded the city. Remember, what did Jesus say? When you see the armies surround Jerusalem, flee to the mountains. Now, they could know before the armies got to Jerusalem that they're coming. We'll get to that in a few moments. The siege started by attacking that third wall. And the third wall took about a month to breach. But after they got past the third wall, the second wall was fairly easy. There, by the way, right here is the fort of Anatolia. That provided a little bit of protection, but it made the temple harder to get at. But the Romans were here now. We're here now in May. They're in this part here. And the Romans numerous times tried to capture this fortress. They couldn't do it. And so they had to launch a secret attack and succeeded. Following this, remember, this sits higher than the rest of the city. Titus raised the banks of the city in order to make it easier and in order to get into the temple. Now, after the Jews killed a bunch of Roman soldiers, Josephus claimed that Titus sent him to negotiate with the defenders, but the Jews wounded him, and so Titus continued. Overlooking the Temple Mount, this fortress here, provided a perfect point from which to attack the temple itself. Battering rams made little progress, but the fighting eventually set the walls on fire, and a Roman soldier threw a burning stick into one of the temple walls. Fire spread quickly and soon out of control, and the temple was captured and destroyed in August of 70 A.D., and the flames spread throughout the residential parts of the city around here. The Roman legions quickly crushed the remaining Jewish resistance. Some of the remaining Jews escaped through the hidden tunnels and sewers, while others made a final stand here in the upper city. Made their final stand here. But Herod's palace fell. Herod's palace fell on the 7th of September, 70 A.D., and the complete control of the city was under the Romans on the 8th of September. Not one stone was left upon another, meaning the city was utterly destroyed. It's not that there wasn't parts that stood. Jesus is using an analogy here, or a metaphor here, saying it's going to be completely destroyed. That's exactly what happened in 70 A.D. It's not been rebuilt to this day. Remember that picture of the Dome of the Rock? All that was left was that western wall. The temple's not been rebuilt. Yes, the Muslims have erected a wall, but it's not the grand place that it was in the time of the Jews and this temple. Those who fled, I've moved the map a little further up. Those who did get out fled down here to Masada, where they remained for 3 more years until 960 of them committed suicide rather than falling to the Roman army. Josephus said that the war, and this is the war in all of Judea, cost about 1.1 million people their lives, and 100,000 were taken captive. Remember Luke 21 says, some will be taken captive. That's exactly what happened again. And yet, not among those dead were the Christians who fled Jerusalem. Many years earlier, you saw that the Romans were coming. And the Romans were coming and they were ruthless. And so where some of these people went was up to here, to a place called Pella, and they spread out all the way around because they wanted to get as far away as possible. They fled to the mountains, just exactly as Jesus said, in order to escape. Those who escaped believed Jesus and were delivered. The destruction of Jerusalem in every detail was fulfilled just as Jesus said it was 37 years earlier. This, I hope, gives you the picture of exactly what happened. When we say the destruction of Jerusalem, it wasn't a one-day event. It took, May, June, July, took 4 months, actually 5 months, to completely accomplish. But it was a part of a 3-year war in which the Romans completely came in and took over and expelled many of the Jews because Jesus said it would happen. But there's another part of the question that the disciples asked. In Matthew 24, verses 36 to 39, Jesus answered that question about the time of his coming. But as of that day and hour knows no one, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. We don't know when Jesus is going to come again. But just as the prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem came to pass, this one will too. But when it does, there will be no fleeing to the mountains. There will be no escape, only judgment. In order to be ready, we must be Christians. Christians escaped Jerusalem because they believed what Jesus said. Christians will escape eternal punishment. People will escape eternal punishment if they become Christians and believe and obey what Jesus said. He said we need to believe in him. We need to repent of our sins. We need to confess our faith and be baptized for the remission of our sins. Following this, we need to live faithfully until death or until Christ comes again. That is what Jesus said. Will we do it and be saved, or not do it and be lost?
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to